Why are we having all these people from shithole countries come here? He then suggested that the United States should instead bring more people from countries like Norway, whose prime minister he met on Wednesday.
That's the racist element. Norwegians are white. They're Northern Europeans. He was referring earlier in his vulgar comment to Africans and Haitians, who are mostly of African descent. These are racist comments. He said things like this.
World's leading superpowers are locking horns.
Game on here. A trade war between the United States and China is here.
Over the past 16 months, America and China have been trading blows through tariffs on goods.
We are looking at a reality that has, a 25% tariff on every single product that would come in from China.
The impact is being felt on industries worldwide. But what is the story behind the America-China trade war?
We have to be careful with China. Look, I have a great relationship with President Xi, but sometimes it gets testy because China likes to take advantage of people, and they can't take advantage of us. But we have a fair relationship with China, and I think it'll be fine. And if it's not, that's okay too. You have to do and go where the punches are thrown. You got to put up the blocks. We have a lot of punches being thrown, and we've been very successful.
中非友好穿越时空，跨越山海，薪火相传。2000年，中非合作论坛成立，在中非关系史上具有重要里程碑意义。24年来，特别是新时代以来，中国同非
It's making BRICS angry, and the only big winner is China. Meanwhile, the US is beginning to see big cracks forming. The economy is being split into two worlds, one where AI companies and big tech, they're living it up. A lot of money is being poured into the system there. But Main Street is suffering. Inflation is rebounding and employment is weakening. However, Trump still doesn't see...
Have you noticed something huge is happening in 2025, yet almost no one is talking about it? The US and China, two economic superpowers, are locked in an unprecedented trade and tech war, skyrocketing tariffs, restrictions on rare metal exports pushing the entire world to the brink of change. So here's the question. Why would a conflict that seems like just a trade pun...
China, India and the United States, responsible for nearly half of global emissions, are not in attendance. President Xi Jinping won't be there, but China is sending a large delegation. As the world's biggest polluter, China's role remains critical. The country is also leading the clean energy push, installing more renewables and rolling out more electric vehicles than any other country. The key question now...
世界会更好。
China this month celebrates the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative, which ranks as the world's biggest development program ever undertaken by a single country. Over the last 10 years, the BRI, as it's generally called, has seen Chinese financial institutions lending close to $1 trillion.
China and Africa account for 1/3 of the world population. Without our modernization, there will be no global modernization. In the next 3 years, China will work with Africa to take the following 10 partnership actions for modernization to deepen China-Africa cooperation and spearhead the Global South modernization. China will voluntarily and unilaterally open its market wider.
We will implement China-Africa Agricultural Modernization Plan. China will share its experience in agricultural development with Africa and transfer readily applicable technologies to it. We encourage Chinese enterprises to engage in large-scale farming, animal husbandry, and grain storage and processing in Africa to create more local jobs and increase farmers' income.
But there have been grocery prices.
No, 401ks. People have 401ks. Their 401ks are double what they were a year ago.
But for people that don't have 401ks or are not invested in the stock market,
but
they've seen their grocery prices go up. Inflation.
No, you're wrong. They went up under Biden. Right now, they're going down. Other than beef, which we're working on, which we can sell around with us, I can tell you that.
A lot of MAGA folks are not thrilled about this idea of hundreds of thousands of foreign students in the United States. We have about 350,000 Chinese. One point during COVID, you were going to, push to, get them out, but that was pulled back. You've said as many as 600,000 Chinese students could come to the United States. Why, sir, is that a pro-MAGA position when so many American kids want to go to school and there are places not for them, and these universities are getting rich off Chinese money?
Sure. Never said about China, but we do have a lot of people coming in from China. We always have, China and other countries. We also have a massive system of colleges and universities. And if we were to cut that in half, which perhaps makes some people happy, you would have half the colleges in the United States go out of business.
So what?
Well, I think that's a big deal.
Are they fans
You would have the
of the United States?
Yeah, but you would have, as you know, historically, black colleges and universities would all be out of business. You would have a system of colleges and universities would go down the tubes.
So we're dependent on China to keep our university system going?
But I think it's good to have, I actually think it's good to have outside countries. Look, I want to be able to get along with the world.
They're not the French. They're the Chinese. They spy on us. They steal our intellectual property.
What, do you think the French are better?
Yeah.
I mean, really? I don't know. I'll tell you, I'm not so sure. We've had a lot of problems with the French where we get taxed very unfairly on our technology, where, you know, they put 25% taxes on American products. Look, assuming everyone treats us badly, because that's the way I am, but we take in trillions of dollars from students. You know, the students pay more than double when they come in from most foreign countries.
The year began with quiet whispers in the world's financial corridors, whispers that grew louder as reports surfaced of a historic partnership between Africa and China. The deal, valued at over $500 billion, was more than just an investment. It was a declaration that global power was shifting, that the patterns of dependency that had defined the last century were breaking apart. For the first time in generations, the continents of the South were speaking in a united economic voice, one backed by infrastructure, industry, and ambition. No one in the West saw it coming, not at this scale. For years, policymakers had dismissed Africa as a developing market, an afterthought compared to Asia's industrial might, or Europe's regulatory sophistication. Yet while they debated and delayed, an entirely new system was being built. Roads carved through red earth, rail lines cut across savannas, ports expanded under the weight of new trade, and digital networks hummed quietly in the background. It was not aid. It was partnership, one based on mutual gain and strategic foresight. The $513 billion flowed like a river through the continent's veins. Some of it built highways and megaports, some funded renewable energy grids, some fortified digital economies and industrial parks. Africa was transforming, not through charity, but through calculated collaboration. The vision was clear: turn resources into value, minerals into technology, and potential into productivity. Factories that had once stood silent were now alive with motion. The clang of steel met the rhythm of ambition. In the coastal zones, new shipyards constructed vessels designed for both regional and international trade. Inland, where copper, cobalt, and lithium once left unprocessed, smelters and refineries now dotted the horizon. For decades, the raw materials had traveled east and west, enriching other economies while Africa watched, but that era had ended. Now the materials stayed. Now they built cities. In the early months after the agreement, the tone from Western financial centers was dismissive, unsustainable. One economist declared, "Debt diplomacy," another warned. But the numbers told a different story. Africa's GDP growth doubled within 2 years. Unemployment rates dropped as new industries emerged. The continental free trade network expanded beyond imagination, allowing goods, data, and people to move with speed that rivaled Europe's own systems. And then came the shock that no one in Washington had anticipated: the shift in global reserve currency usage. African nations, long reliant on the dollar for imports and international trade, began conducting more business in yuan. Slowly at first, and then all at once, the greenback's dominance began to erode. The symbolic power of the dollar, the foundation of U.S. global influence, was fading under the weight of a new reality. Trust had moved elsewhere. Inside the offices of major American corporations, panic rippled like a storm. Contracts that had once seemed secure were quietly canceled. African governments, emboldened by their newfound leverage, renegotiated deals that had for decades favored foreign companies. Mining licenses were rewritten to include profit-sharing clauses. Renewable energy projects required joint ownership. The continent was not just demanding fairness, it was enforcing it. Trade delegations scrambled to repair what had been lost, but they were too late. The narrative had shifted. Africa no longer viewed itself as a supplier. It was now a producer. The continent's leaders spoke not of aid but of equity, not of dependence but of direction, and behind them stood an ally willing to fund, build, and believe. In Washington, think tanks convened emergency panels. Television pundits debated how the once sleeping giant of Africa had awakened so suddenly. Analysts pored over data, struggling to make sense of the speed at which influence had reversed. The truth was simpler than they wished to admit. Africa had never been asleep, it had simply been ignored. Now it had options. The ripple effects reached beyond economics. The global balance of diplomacy tilted sharply. At international summits, African delegations no longer sought approval. They offered partnerships. They spoke with confidence about green industrialization, AI integration, and resource sovereignty. Every handshake, every contract signed in African capitals carried a message that echoed across continents. The future would not be dictated, it would be negotiated. Across the Atlantic, in quiet moments behind closed doors, American officials conceded what they could not say publicly. The empire of economic dominance was cracking. For decades, control over commodities, logistics, and finance had defined geopolitical power. But the foundation of that system, control over where raw materials came from and where value was added, was now shifting southward. In ports once dominated by Western shipping lines, new cranes lifted containers bearing new logos. In universities across the continent, the next generation of scientists and engineers trained not for export but for leadership. The intellectual migration that had once drained Africa's brightest minds had begun to reverse. Young innovators returned home to find laboratories, funding, and opportunity waiting. Meanwhile, U.S. markets trembled. Supply chains reliant on African cobalt and lithium faced unprecedented costs. Technology firms, unable to secure affordable inputs, scaled back production. Electric vehicle manufacturers warned of shortages. Energy companies saw delays in refining contracts. The entire ecosystem that had quietly depended on Africa's raw exports was unraveling. And yet, amid the turbulence, Africa stood calm. Its strategy had been long in the making, built not on sudden rebellion but on years of planning, negotiation, and quiet cooperation. The $513 billion investment was not just money, it was infrastructure, data networks, human capital, and strategic patience woven together. Each railway line, each fiber cable, each industrial park was a thread in a new global fabric. As global media outlets tried to make sense of it all, one question dominated every headline: how did this happen? The answer was complex yet clear. It happened because Africa chose to believe in itself. It happened because another power believed in Africa's future more than others believed in its limits. By the time Washington understood, it was too late to stop. The world's supply chains had reoriented, trade routes had shifted, influence had changed hands. The same continent once described as the world's last frontier was now the heart of a new order. In the end, it wasn't a war nor a confrontation. It was a quiet revolution, an economic rewriting of history. The old global balance, built on control, debt, and dependency, had been replaced by partnership, purpose, and potential. The map of power had been redrawn, not with borders and armies, but with investment, technology, and trust. The world had turned, and Africa was finally at its center. The ripple from the $513 billion alliance did not stop at Africa's borders. It rolled outward like a seismic wave, shaking the foundations of the global economic order. Across the Atlantic, boardrooms buzzed with unease as graphs plunged and forecasts dimmed. For decades, the West had written the script for global trade setting. Prices, dictating policies, and determining who thrived or fell. But that script was being rewritten. The center of economic gravity had shifted, and the world was watching as Africa and its new partner redrew the rules. Factories across Europe began to feel the tremors first. Industries that relied heavily on Africa's raw materials, lithium for batteries, cobalt for energy storage, copper for electronics, found themselves locked. Out of the old comfort of cheap supply, African nations had imposed new trade frameworks that favored local processing and continental manufacturing. What used to be a simple export of raw ores was now a complex negotiation requiring technology transfer and fair revenue sharing. The flow of resources that had long powered Western economies was being redirected inward, fueling African refineries, plants, and research centers instead. Across Asia, policymakers quietly acknowledged the brilliance of the strategy. The deal was not built on loans or exploitation. It was built on shared value creation. Infrastructure built by joint ventures now served not only transport and mining but also agriculture, digital trade, and clean energy. From solar farms in the Sahel to smart ports along the Indian Ocean, Africa was becoming an interconnected powerhouse. This was the first time in modern history that the continent was not waiting for permission to industrialize, it was doing it on its own terms. The global markets struggled to adjust. Investors who had once poured money into Western industrial giants were now redirecting capital to emerging African tech zones. The most successful funds were those that pivoted early, recognizing that the global economy was entering a multipolar phase. Yet, in Washington and Brussels, denial persisted. Analysts insisted it was temporary, that the momentum would fade, but the data told another story. Africa's share in global manufacturing output had tripled in less than 5 years, while Western export revenues in critical sectors fell sharply. The reaction from Western leaders grew desperate. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched to reassess relations, offering deals that only a decade ago would have seemed impossible reduced. Tariffs, technology access, even joint training programs, yet African negotiators no longer carried the tone of dependency. They were measured, confident, aware of their leverage. They spoke not from weakness, but from strength built on new partnerships and economic diversification. In the background, Africa's digital revolution surged. Fiber optic networks connected capitals once isolated by geography. Local fintech firms rivaled global players. Digital currencies pegged to baskets of resources, gold, cobalt, and rare earths began circulating within regional trade blocs. The dependency on the US dollar continued to erode, replaced by systems that valued what the continent actually produced. The psychological power once held by Western currencies began to fade, replaced by an emerging belief: Africa could sustain itself. The cultural shift was as significant as the economic one, for generations. The global narrative had portrayed Africa as a place of potential, never performance of raw materials, never innovation. But with new universities built under this partnership, research hubs were blooming. African scientists led projects in green technology, quantum computing, and biotechnology. Their findings were no longer exported abroad for validation. They were published, patented, and commercialized at home. The intellectual dependency that once defined post-colonial economies was breaking apart. Meanwhile, the Western corporate world panicked. Multinational conglomerates that had once enjoyed near-monopoly access to African markets now found themselves excluded from bids or forced into joint ventures under new African majority ownership laws. Shareholders grumbled, CEOs resigned. In the chaos, many companies sought to move their headquarters to African cities, hoping proximity might restore their relevance. Some succeeded, but most found the competition fierce. Local firms were no longer willing to play subordinate roles. In global trade summits, the shift was impossible to ignore. Delegates from Africa commanded attention, not through defiance, but through results. Infrastructure progress reports, economic growth charts, and sustainable energy metrics spoke louder than speeches. Nations once considered aid-dependent were now creditors, offering loans to smaller economies in exchange for trade access. The irony was not lost on observers. The very nations that had once dictated terms to Africa were now applying for its favor. Western media tried to reframe the story, painting the shift as a geopolitical risk or a hidden trap. But public sentiment was changing. Citizens across the globe, weary of economic inequality and corporate greed, looked to Africa's rise with admiration. It represented something pure, a long overdue rebalancing of power. It showed that progress could emerge from collaboration rather than coercion, from inclusion rather than dominance. The turning point came when several African nations jointly launched a satellite system designed entirely by African engineers. The event was symbolic, but its impact was monumental. It demonstrated technological independence, something Western powers had spent decades discouraging. With control over its own communications infrastructure, Africa gained not just data sovereignty but also global respect. Tech companies, energy firms, and logistics networks all began recalibrating strategies around this new reality. Africa was not just a participant in globalization, it was now shaping it. The US response was telling. Think tanks flooded the media with reports about overreach, warning that the global economy was entering a dangerous phase. Yet behind closed doors, policymakers understood that what had happened was irreversible. The flow of resources, capital, and influence was tilting toward Africa, and nothing short of a global crisis could undo it. In this new world order, Africa stood not as a pawn in the rivalry between superpowers but as a broker and equal. The $513 billion partnership had been a catalyst, but the movement it unleashed was self-sustaining. Trade within Africa was expanding faster than trade between Africa and the West. The dream of economic self-determination, long spoken but never realized, was now tangible. By the time the West tried to adapt, it was clear that a new economic geography had taken root. Ports on the Atlantic and Indian Oceans thrived with exports of finished goods, electronics, vehicles, pharmaceuticals labeled Made in Africa. The transformation had begun as a financial deal, but it evolved into something far greater, a psychological revolution. Africa believed in itself, and that belief changed everything. The global order that once revolved around Western capital now orbited a new center, one defined by ambition, resilience, and unity. The same voices that once dismissed Africa as too risky or too unstable now echoed in admiration. The age of dependency was over. The age of African leadership had begun. The transformation that began with the $513 billion alliance had now reached full momentum. Across the globe, analysts, economists, and political strategists watched in disbelief as Africa's rapid rise reshaped global trade and diplomacy. What many in the West had dismissed as a symbolic gesture of partnership had evolved into a structural shift, one that dismantled a century-old economic hierarchy. No longer was Africa a source of cheap materials or a passive market for finished goods. It had become the engine of global growth, the new frontier of innovation, and the silent force rewriting the rules of power. Inside African capitals, the atmosphere was electric. Mega projects were springing up in record time: smart industrial parks, high-speed rail corridors, and manufacturing hubs connected by digital logistics platforms. The continent's largest economies had synchronized their trade policies under a unified framework that prioritized African value chains over foreign extraction. Instead of competing for the favor of Western investors, nations were collaborating to create shared prosperity. African economists referred to it as the Great Reclamation, a deliberate undoing of the exploitative patterns that had defined centuries of foreign trade. China had provided the spark through investment, but Africa had provided the vision. The old idea of dependence was gone. In its place stood self-reliance, built on the principles of mutual benefit, resource sovereignty, and technological independence. The ripple effects in Washington were dramatic. Meetings that once centered on global dominance now revolved around containment. For the first time, U.S. officials admitted privately that their sanctions and tariff strategies had backfired. The trade routes once dominated by American companies were now controlled by joint African-Asian consortiums. The petrodollar's dominance was quietly eroding as African nations began trading commodities using new regional settlement systems. The shift was subtle but devastating. It undermined the foundation of America's global influence, the dollar itself. The panic was palpable on Wall Street. Stock markets wobbled as investors withdrew from traditional safe havens and poured funds into emerging African economies. American industrial giants faced massive losses as their raw material costs soared. Cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements, all essential for advanced technologies, were now priced through new African-led exchanges. The old dependency model had turned against its creators. For decades, the West had extracted Africa's resources cheaply. Now Africa was setting the terms. Europe fared little better. Manufacturing centers in Germany and France struggled to meet production demands as input costs skyrocketed. The very same governments that had once preached free trade now scrambled to negotiate preferential deals with African states. The tables had turned completely. African negotiators walked into talks with confidence, demanding technology sharing, job creation, and long-term development guarantees. There was no desperation in their tone, only certainty. They were no longer begging for inclusion. They were granting access. Meanwhile, Africa's internal markets were flourishing. The new economic blocs had triggered a wave of intracontinental investment. Entrepreneurs were building digital banks, logistics networks, and biotech startups with regional support. A generation of young innovators who had once fled abroad for opportunity were now returning home. They found not only jobs but purpose, a chance to be part of something historic. The partnership with China evolved as well. What began as investment soon transformed into collaboration in science, infrastructure, and defense. African engineers co-led major projects, from green energy grids to AI-driven agriculture systems. The continent was no longer importing technology, it was adapting, improving, and exporting it. In the span of a decade, Africa had gone from a consumer of innovation to a producer. The West, unable to compete through economic might, turned to narrative warfare. Think tanks and media outlets launched a coordinated campaign, framing Africa's rise as dangerous dependence or strategic vulnerability. They warned that the partnership with China was a trap, a means of control disguised as cooperation. Yet these narratives failed to gain traction. The evidence of Africa's transformation was visible: cleaner cities, functioning transport systems, growing middle classes, and reduced unemployment. The results spoke louder than propaganda. In global forums, African delegates began setting agendas. Proposals once dismissed as idealistic such as fair trade pricing, debt restructuring, and climate reparations were now gaining global endorsement. Africa's collective voice carried weight because it represented real power, not just moral appeal. The balance of global voting blocs shifted as nations aligned themselves with the African model of shared development. Diplomatic realignments followed. Latin American and Southeast Asian countries began adopting similar frameworks, prioritizing regional integration and resource sovereignty. The Western monopoly over trade finance started to crumble as alternative institutions funded jointly by African, Asian, and Middle Eastern capital took center stage. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank found themselves increasingly irrelevant in the new order. In Washington, frustration turned into fear. Reports circulated among senior officials describing Africa as the new global pivot. The U.S. had underestimated the consequences of its own policies, tariffs, sanctions, and diplomatic arrogance had driven nations away. When Africa opened its doors to China's partnership, it wasn't out of desperation but out of strategic calculation. The continent had watched how the West weaponized finance and trade, and it chose a path of independence instead. The cultural shift was perhaps the most profound. Across Africa, a new generation of leaders was emerging, pragmatic, visionary, and unapologetically African. They were fluent in technology, economics, and geopolitics. They rejected the old dependency mindset and championed policies that prioritized local empowerment. In universities, curricula shifted from colonial history to innovation, governance, and continental cooperation. The psychological liberation was complete. By the end of the decade, Africa's influence extended far beyond trade. It had become the moral compass of the global economy, the advocate for sustainability, equality, and fairness. While Western economies wrestled with inflation and inequality, Africa was building a system that worked for its people. The irony was unmistakable. The continent, once seen as the world's weakest link, had become its stabilizing force. The United States faced an identity crisis. It could no longer dictate terms to the world. Its corporations, used to commanding markets, now competed for contracts under African rules. Even its allies questioned its leadership, choosing instead to diversify partnerships. The age of unilateral dominance was over. A new multipolar era had begun, one in which Africa stood at the center, not the periphery. Yet Africa's leaders knew this transformation was fragile. They understood that unity was their greatest weapon and their greatest challenge. Without it, old divisions could resurface, inviting external manipulation. But for now, the momentum was undeniable. Economic independence had bred political confidence, and political confidence had bred cultural pride. The true measure of Africa's success was not in GDP growth or trade surpluses, but in mindset. The continent had discovered its value not through validation from abroad, but through collective belief. The partnership that had started as a bold gamble had become the cornerstone of a new world order. In cities once considered forgotten, skyscrapers gleamed, powered by locally produced energy. African airlines dominated global routes. Universities ranked among the world's best. The dream of a united, prosperous continent was no longer fantasy, it was reality unfolding before the eyes of a stunned world. And in the corridors of power in Washington, the realization finally sank in. The era of African dependency was over. The age of African leadership had arrived. The world had shifted permanently.